Okay, welcome back, grade 10s. I hope you guys had a good weekend. So we are all done with animal cells, and what we're going to be moving on to now is plant systems, and we're going to talk a little bit about plant cells. Now, we're not going to spend very much time on plants in comparison to the animal cells. We spend a little bit more time in grade 11, so if you're really liking plants, then you'll pick it up in grade 11. Okay. So just recall, we've previously been studying animal systems, specifically human systems. So we've gone through the cardiovascular, respiratory, the GI system, the nervous system, the musculoskeletal system. We've been really kind of focusing on humans. Okay? Now, humans are a type of animal, okay? And they all are contained animal cells. So if you look over here at my picture I have a variety of different animals here. Now, they're not all represented. We've got to remember also that we have like worms and corals and all kinds of different things that are animals. And they all share one thing in common. Okay? One is that they're all multicellular. There's not a single animal that's not multicellular. So they all have to be composed of a bunch of cells altogether. And the other thing they all share in common is they're all composed of animal cells. Okay? So all living things are made up of one cell, if you're prokaryotic, or multicellular, eukaryotic. Now, animals are all multicellular or eukaryotic, and same with plants, the ones that we focus on. If you like the other prokaryotics and all the other types of cells, we're going to go through them in grade 11. Because in grade 11, our first topic is the 6 major classes of life. Now, we only talk about 2 of them in this course, animals and plants. But if you go on farther and you decide to take this in grade 11, we'll talk about fungi cells, protist cells, and then also bacteria cells. There's 2 types. Okay. So our next topic, we're going to specifically talk about plant cells, okay, and what plants are. So plants are the most important living thing on Earth. Okay? By far, of all the living things, animals, protists, fungi, bacteria, by far plants are the most important. And the reason why they're so important is they're required by all other living things to survive. Every food chain begins with a plant. Okay? So no matter whether you're any kind of animal or any kind of protist or bacteria, you're all coming down to a plant because every living thing needs to eat at some point either an animal or an animal that at some point eats plants. So plants must colonize an area first. Then other things are capable of living there. If you don't have plants in a certain area, then you don't have the start of a food chain, and you can't have really any other animals. So areas that have limited number of plants, like the desert, which does have some plants, and that's why it has some animal life, although it's very, very limited. The other area that has very limited amount of plants is the tundra. Okay? And the tundra, having very, very limited number of plants, also has very limited animal life because animals require plants. Another example is the Dead Sea. So the Dead Sea is an area of water that basically the salt content is so high that plants can't live on there. If it's really, really salty, it will kill plants. And if you kill the plants, then no animals can live there. So although animals are capable of living in the salty water, because plants aren't, then the animals have nothing to eat. Okay? So plants are the only living things that are capable of making their own food from water, air, and sunlight. Everything else has to either eat a plant or eat an animal that eats a plant. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the structure of plants. So all plants are multicellular, like I mentioned, made up of plant cells. Now, so they're all generally green in color. Not every single one is green in color, but most are generally green in color, and they're all incapable of movement. Now, that's a characteristic that's unique to animals. Okay? Animals are capable of movement where plants aren't. Okay? Now, they also contain a special chemical that other cells do not, called chlorophyll, that allows them to make their own food and gives them their green color. Okay? So we don't have chlorophyll, protists don't have chlorophyll, bacteria don't have chlorophyll, and because they don't have it, they're unable to make their own food. So it's a special chemical that only plants have. Now there's many types of plants. We have ferns and mosses, and that's kind of, I'll take the highlighter and I'll kind of show you the area that I'm talking about here. So these are kind of examples of ferns and mosses. They're our first plants to evolve. Plants originally evolved from the water and they moved their way to land. And the first land plants were these mosses. They didn't really even have roots. And they can't grow very tall. They're very similar to what you would see in the water because they came from the water. And then as they evolved, we get into more of our coniferous plants, which we have over here. So this is what we kind of see up in northern Ontario, or we see them in Blenheim or Chatham as well. They're known as evergreens. They're plants that don't really have leaves. They have needles and pine cones and things like that. They don't lose their leaves over the winter. And then the other plants that we have are called flowering plants, and those are the ones that we're going to specifically talk about today. And those are the ones like that produce leaves. They lose their leaves every year, as well as the ones that are responsible for the fruits and vegetables that we eat. So that's what we're going to primarily focus on. So flowering plants were the last to evolve. They're the most complex of all the plants. Okay? And a flowering plant is really made up of 2 main parts, the shoot system Okay, and that's this area right here, everything above the ground. And then we have the root system, which is everything below the ground. And those are really the two main systems. Okay. All right, plant structure is very different than animals, as they do not require muscles, they don't require a skeleton, a nervous system to coordinate all these different movements. Because they're not moving, they don't need as many systems as we require. So plants, similar to animals, do require a transportation system. They do need to be able to transport things like, say, when a plant gets water from down here and then it needs to transport it all the way up its stem. So they do need a transportation system similar to what we need. We call it a cardiovascular system. In a plant, it's just called a vascular system. They take out the cardio. Okay. And they also need a system to exchange gases. So right along the leaves right here and on the stem as well. Okay. Basically, gases go in and out. So we should know that oxygen is produced from plants, but a lot of people don't realize that oxygen is actually used by plants as well. So plants will produce oxygen. It will also produce CO2, and the plant will also take in CO2 and oxygen. Okay, we got the root and the shoot. All right, so we're going to kind of focus in on just the root system first. Remember I mentioned that there's two types of with the root system. So flowering plants secure structure in terms of the root system. So root systems grow below the ground and has three main purposes. Right? They need to anchor the plant so that it doesn't fall over or fall out, especially in wind or other animals trying to pull them out. They absorb water and nutrients from the soil, and they bring those up the stem into different parts of the plant. And they also store food. So an example would be like a potato or a carrot or a radish. Okay, sometimes they use their roots for storage. Other plants use fruits for storage. Some use vegetables for storage. Some will use their roots as storage. So roots vary from very small to very large, and the type of environment will determine the type of roots that require. Okay, depending on whether you're growing in sandy soil, or whether you're growing in clay, or whether you're growing on even potentially a rock, will determine the type of roots that you have. Okay, now, generally, there's two main types of roots, which is called the tap root, which is just one main root, which are kind of highlighting over here in yellow. So that's where it's just one super large kind of like bulk root. And then the other type is the fibrous root, and that's where they kind of all break apart. Okay, and they're all little different sections. Okay, that would be example would be grass, grains, and corn. Okay, so we've now done the root system. Now we're going to go through the shoot system, okay, which is everything above. So the shoot system has more parts than the root system. We're going to focus on three main parts of the shoot system: the leaves, the stems, and the flower. We're going to kind of just briefly talk about the purposes of those three. So the shoot system is specialized for two main purposes. One, to conduct photosynthesis, and that is a very, very important process. And then the second part is to create flowers for reproduction, okay, where the flowers will pop out, and what a flower is really just a reproductive tool for the plant. So each part of the shoot, the leaf, flower, and stem, provides a distinct function to allow the shoot system to do its duties. Okay, flowers are what turns into most fruits and vegetables. So one thing that I was surprised at, because I didn't know a lot about plants, is that when we have things like apples or we have cherries, what those essentially were those fruits, and along with vegetables, used to be flowers, and the flowers transition into those fruits and vegetables. Okay, so let's go through the three parts. We're going to start with the leaves. So the leaf is the main structure used to complete photosynthesis, okay, to actually make the food. It's the power plants for making food on the plant. So water, carbon dioxide, and sunlight combine in the leaf to make glucose, okay, and that's what we kind of determine as food. It's just a carbohydrate. It also produces oxygen gas. Okay. So leaves are responsible for gas exchange. So what we have is when you look at a leaf, okay, you're going to have CO2 going into the leaf. You're going to have oxygen leaving the leaf, but you're also going to have oxygen going into the leaf and CO2 coming out. So really CO2 goes in and out, and oxygen goes in and out of the leaf. And that's where gas exchange occurs. We have lungs that it occurs in humans. In plants it occurs at their leaves. Now these are also responsible for absorbing sunlight and tend to make large surface areas. Right? So when you kind of look at a leaf's kind of how they've evolved to have these massive surface areas so that they're all basically flat, very, very thin, and can hit as much sunlight as possible. Now, the last thing about leaves, there is some leaves that are edibles, okay? Like we do eat like tea leaves or spinach or green onion. Okay, we can actually eat the leaves and we can get nutrition out of them. Not all leaves, but certain ones. Okay, the next part is the flowering. So the flowers are specialized structures used for reproduction of the plant. That's what they're using the flowers for. It's their form of reproduction. So they contain both male and female parts. So some you have male flowers, other are female flowers, but some flowers actually contain both, where they'll have both male and female parts. So the picture that I have down here shows both the male and the female parts. Okay. So I'm just going to kind of show you the difference between them. So this is the female part right here. Okay. And this is where basically there's an egg down inside here in the ovule. And this little opening up here at the top is where the pollen will come inside. So the pollen will come inside, go down in here, fertilize the egg, and then we'll turn that into a fertilized seed. Okay, and then you're just going to have pollen that just kind of floats around there. Now, the male parts are these parts right here, okay, that I've kind of circled. And what they basically do is they release pollen. Now, you may think, well, aren't they going to self-fertilize themselves? Aren't they going to release that pollen into the female part and essentially self-fertilize themselves? And that is a possibility. It does happen sometimes, but plants will put some effort in to try and not self-fertilize so that they actually release the pollen out into the air and they reach another flower's female part. Okay. All right, so just I have male parts release the pollen while the female parts produce the eggs. The combination creates a fertilized seed capable of making a new plant. Now, some plants use wind to carry the pollen, like I kind of showed in my example, but some will use animals like bees and hummingbirds to also transfer that pollen. Okay, now the seed in the flowering plant is often encased in a fruit or vegetable by the plant. Okay, so if you look over here at the right, this kind of picture I have here, okay, this is a tomato plant and kind of what's happened. So you originally had the flower. Okay, so this is a tomato plant flower, if you've ever seen a tomato plant growing. Okay, they have flowers, and this is the flower that they make. So after that flower gets fertilized, okay, and what that fertilized means is that you've fertilized the seed, then the seed or the flower starts transitioning over into a premature tomato and then eventually a full tomato. And the seeds are encased inside of here. Okay, so that fertilized seed. So that tomato will then could fall on the ground. Okay, as it falls on the ground, it starts breaking apart. Those seeds get into the ground, and then you have a different tomato plant. Okay, the last part that I wanted to talk about was just the stem system. So flowering plant stems have several functions, okay? And the stems, I'm talking about the main part going down here. Okay, we do have like branch stems and leaf stems, but I'm talking about the main stem that goes up from the top to the bottom. So one thing, it supports the branches and leaves and the flowers, okay? It's the structural component, making sure the leaves don't fall on the ground and the flower doesn't fall on the ground. It's also responsible for transporting substances from the roots. So it gets kind of water and nutrients down here, and it will send it up, and it'll send it down to that leaf, and then to that leaf, and then up to the flower as needed. Okay. It also provides an area for storage of food. So some plants will store their food in the stem. Okay, an example would be like sugarcane. It also provides protection from insects. So often it's the toughest part of the plant that has the roughest exterior to try and prevent insects from being able to burrow in. Okay. Now, we use stems for plants. We use it, like I mentioned, sugarcane is an edible component. But we often use it for products where we'll take the stem of, say, a tree and turn it into wood or paper or cork. Okay. So that's it on the part 1 of plants. We'll move on to part 2.